Hi, my name is Robin Hall, and I'm the Policy Advisor in the Department for Education on teacher workload.
Hello, my name is Richard Churches and I work for Education Development Trust. Unfortunately, my colleague Kate Sims can't be with us today. She was also involved in the project.
As a Department of Education, we have a lot of evidence around the impact that high workload can have on the teaching profession, in particular around well-being, mental health, and its knock-on effects on teacher retention rates. So we've been working for a number of years now with schools and other organisations to see if we can reduce the amount of workload that teachers have and help them work in more efficient ways. And one of the ways that we've done that is we've produced and published a toolkit on gov.uk with a number of strategies that schools can use that was put together by schools to help them find better ways of marking, planning and managing pupil data. What we don't know is how these different approaches will actually impact on pupil attainment and progress. So in order to find out more about that, we launched this project. We know that school leaders are reluctant to try out new approaches because of accountability pressures. They feel that they have to be seen to be doing things that are known to work. So the idea of this project was to get some evidence by schools trying out some of the approaches and measuring their impact. First of all, on teachers, to check that our approaches really did help reduce teacher workload, but also to check that they didn't have any negative impacts on pupil progress. We had anecdotal evidence from the schools who'd created the resources that this was the case, but we wanted to be sure, and we wanted to have more concrete evidence that would help schools disseminate, take up these approaches more widely. We also know from work we did previously with the National College for School Leadership, that schools tend to pick up more on evidence and examples from other schools rather than from the department. Hence the need to include schools much more in the way the project worked, in the hope that the schools would then tell other schools about what they'd done and how effective it had been. So we commissioned the Education Development Trust to work alongside the Teaching School Council to recruit a number of schools from around the country and provide them with the right kind of support on how to carry out their projects in a robust way and get some strong evidence of how effective these approaches were.
So for a number of years, we've been working with teachers to help them understand how to design controlled research of various sorts. Mostly that's been teacher-led randomized controlled trials, but often other types of design as well, non-randomized controlled trials, and what are called retrospective cohort studies. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. This work began in collaboration with the Department for Education in a project called Closing the Gap Test and Learn. This was a large-scale program in which teachers collaborated to deliver large-scale trials. At the same time, we had two strands of research method training that went on, a qualitative strand that was delivered by Oxford University and a quantitative strand that was delivered by myself at Education Development Trust. We put in place randomized control trial trainings just so the teachers could understand the project they were involved in. But after a few weeks, they started designing trials themselves. And so we expanded the project, gave some grants, developed software to help them analyze their results. And from that project, we've done a number of similar projects around the world. We've delivered training to international schools in Dubai. We had a Wellcome Trust grant a few years ago where we delivered neuroscience-informed teacher-led randomized control trials. Teachers are trained in the neuroscience and cognitive psychology evidence and then conducted their own trials to explore that. We worked with the Velki Foundation. We had Global Teacher Prize nominees conducting research. And we've also delivered training directly to teaching schools themselves. So how does the program work? Well, in this case, we had a one-day design training program using a textbook that I wrote with Eleanor Domick from King's College London. Teachers learned how to design and implement randomized control trials, but they also learned how to design other sorts of variations. So case-matched, non-randomized control trials, and also retrospective cohort studies, where an existing group of pupils is compared to the data from a comparable pupil group from the past or in some cases uncontrolled cohort studies where the same cohort's previous data was compared to their current data. Although there was a variation in the designs that the schools were able to choose, they all completed a research protocol that was then signed off by us and also by the school's principal or head teacher. The schools then implemented their studies, and the treatment windows were a maximum of approximately a term. Some studies went from about September through till just into January, February, but some of the studies were shorter than that. And then the teachers came together to have 2 days of support to understand how to analyze the data and to write up their research in a conference poster format. We have Excel spreadsheets that we shared with them that helped them to analyze their results and helped them to write it up in an easy way. We gave them remote feedback on their conference posters. There was a dissemination event in London just before the coronavirus health emergency started. And then we pulled together whatever national data we had into the meta-analysis that we're talking about now and the analyses. And on the earlier slide, we showed you where you can download the finished research report from on www.gov.uk. So here's an example of a teacher conference poster. We think it's a very efficient way of helping teachers to communicate and disseminate their findings with each other. It follows a standard scientific conference poster approach: research design, method, procedure, participants, materials, etc., the results, the limitations, and some conclusions. So what did the teachers choose to design? We had a very wide range of designs. Often we've tended to restrict teachers to just do randomized control trials, but that wasn't practical in the case of many of our studies. The main reason being that often the school had already decided in advance which cluster of schools or teachers were going to implement the intervention, and therefore a control group had to be found that they would be compared to, a comparable group, and case matching was used in a number of cases to support that. Therefore, randomization wasn't possible. Okay, so teachers also were asked to measure a number of different things, and I'm just going to hand over to Robin to talk through the things we asked teachers to measure.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we were very much interested in finding ways that teachers could carry out the same kind of tasks that they are required to, but in a more efficient way, and reduce the time they spend doing it. So we asked them to, where possible, measure how long they spent on the various target activities, such as marking, planning, or recording and analysing pupil data. But alongside this, we also wanted to get evidence on whether or not it had any effect on the pupils using more efficient methods. So we asked the schools to collect and analyse any of the normal pupil assessment data they would use as part of their standard teaching practice. We also felt, we'd heard anecdotally, that reducing workload might have a positive impact on teacher well-being and generally improve their job satisfaction. So we worked with Richard to develop a way of measuring teacher well-being using the International Personality Item Pool. And some of the schools involved used these questionnaires to get some measure of how the teachers felt about the approaches they were using and whether or not it had improved their well-being.
Yes, the International Personality Item Pool is a really interesting resource. It contains downloadable, free-to-use questions from a whole range of valid and reliable psychometric measures that you can accumulate together. We selected a few that we thought were important. Not all teachers chose to use these. A small cluster did, but the results were very, very useful and interesting indeed. Before I go on to talk about the results, I should just say that the coronavirus health emergency curtailed the final analysis stage of about 40% of the studies. So the results you're going to see now, and the ones in results, only come from perhaps 65% of the schools are actually carrying out the research. So in terms of teacher time, we found that there was a significant reduction in the amount of time the teachers spent on the targeted task. You might raise the question, why would you even measure teacher time when you knew reducing it? Well, we've seen over the years some strategies that head teachers and principals put in place, which although on the surface they might look like they reduce teacher time, are actually quite time consuming. particularly some of the marking strategies that might involve stickers and things like that can actually take more time than traditional marking. So we're very keen to check that the interventions the teachers used had actually reduced time, and they did so with a moderately large effect as well. So that was good to see. The other thing that was noticeable about teacher time was not only was teacher time reduced, but the variation in teacher workload also became tighter. So teachers worked less time, but they were more similar to each other as well. So if you look at the column or in the graph there for control, you can see a very wide variation in teacher time. Some teachers working incredibly long hours, but that variation was reduced by the teacher interventions. So looking at the teacher well-being data, there were 5 scales that we selected from the National Personality Item Pool. One called Workaholism, which is a scale used to assess how hard a person is working in a clinical context. Optimism, self-efficacy, enthusiasm, and love of learning. And we also looked at the combination of those. As you can see, well-being was improved overall across all combined measures, and particularly teachers were not working as hard as they had been before, and their sense of self-efficacy was improved. As Robin said, we were also interested in the extent to which changes in practice might have affected attainment. This is one of the missing areas in terms of research into workload. We were very lucky. Almost all teachers had a measure of attainment in their study, not because they designed special questionnaires or special tests, but just because they used their existing school data, and they analysed that to produce the effect size, confidence interval, and p-value. Therefore, we were able to enter these into a large random effects meta-analysis, which I'm going to show you the forest plots for in a moment. But overall, we were able to look at 112 effect sizes. That's a sample size of nearly 10,000 pupils. And overall, there was a small positive effect, equivalent to a Cohen's d of 0.22, with a confidence interval that's all in the positive. And then we can break that down. We broke that down into subgroup analyses, and for each of the areas the teachers had looked at, reducing communication practices in the school, or streamlining them rather, having different approaches to data recording and reporting, often having fewer data drops, for example, changing lesson observation and monitoring into a different form of strategy that took up less teacher time, and finally marking and feedback. And across all of those, we can see positive, significant effects. You can also download these slides as well as the reports. And if you have a look at the forest plots, you can see this overwhelming positive association between reducing workload and attainment. Of course, we're not suggesting that changing your communication strategy in a school had a direct causal relationship with improved outcomes when it comes to communication, but it was not associated with negative outcomes. If we go through, you can see similar patterns for data recording and reporting and lesson observation. Perhaps the most interesting analysis is the forest plot for marking and feedback. As you'll be aware, anything to the right of the central line shows a positive effect. In other words, the intervention improved outcomes compared to the control. Anything to the right showed that the control did better, the intervention. The error bars in this case are 95% confidence intervals, where you'd expect the effect size to be in 95 out of 100 replications. If I go down, this is not the complete forest plot, it has to be over 3 slides because there's so many effects in it. You can see this pattern emerging where we can say that reducing teacher workload in terms of traditional marking and feedback was overwhelmingly associated with positive outcomes. Where the largest positive effects are found, we were seeing changes in strategy that involved perhaps shifting to more live feedback in the classroom, particularly feedback that might be triggering metacognitive processing. So children might be encouraged to understand the misconception, focus on a goal, identify a learning strategy, improve their work, get more direct feedback straight away. So there are obviously limitations in relation to what we were doing. First of all, there's a very wide variation in the types of designs we pulled together. Sometimes controlled, sometimes uncontrolled data is put into the same meta-analysis. And in terms of the heterogeneity of the data, you can see that in that some of the subgroup meta-analysis heterogeneity is not as strong as you might like it to be. Of course, some sample sizes were small, some were fairly large, and there were variations in the treatment window. Relative short treatment window, even for the longest studies, was probably about a term, and of course that may have reduced the effect sizes. And only 60% of the studies were actually able to complete due to the coronavirus health emergency, and completion would have doubled the sample sizes. But nonetheless, we have some strong data to show that reducing teacher workload was not associated with negative impact, and in fact some evidence that there may be times when certain forms of reduced workload can actually improve attainment. Robin, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, first of all, we're very pleased that the approaches the schools have taken from our workload reduction toolkit did actually seem to reduce the amount of work teachers or the amount of time teachers were spending doing marking, planning, or managing data. We have found from some of our surveys that approaches that schools have tried don't always have that effect, and we often get a disparity between responses from school leaders who feel that they've addressed workload issues, as opposed to teachers who feel that the approaches they've taken haven't really addressed the problems. As we thought, we did find that well-being seemed to improve, which hopefully would have a longer-term impact on teacher retention. But the particularly useful finding from this, from our perspective, was we now have evidence that we can show to school leaders that they don't need to worry particularly about whether or not they're having an impact on pupils by helping teachers to work in a more efficient manner. So there are more effective and less time-consuming ways of providing feedback for pupils rather than giving detailed written feedback, for instance. It was very pleasing as well that schools were able to use their own assessment data, which they used obviously for managing their own pupil progress, which helped to reduce the amount of work involved in the project.
Thanks, Robin. So some useful, interesting information from a research point of view around workload, but also taking a sort of big picture on this, we think that this approach has huge potential as a policy rollout strategy where teachers might be involved in the creation of local, small, school-level research data, ideally with control groups, that can then be amalgamated into a national meta-analysis. And we know from various accounts of evidence-based practice that there are challenges getting teachers to engage in policy evidence and in evidence generally. And some people would point to this being because of the democratic deficit in education research, where much research is not done by serving teachers, it's done by people that no longer serve as teachers or never served as teachers. And of course, that's not the case if we look across at a different world in medicine and healthcare, where it's serving clinicians who conduct that. So what we've been doing here is a sort of citizen science approach to policy implementation, and we think that that has significant and positive benefits going forward. So you can find the references here at the back of the slides as well. And if you want to get in touch to talk more about the project, I'm very happy to take you. Thanks very much.